Welcome, everybody. My name is Alvin Ashcraft, and this topic is all about choosing the best UI framework for your next Windows app. There's a ton of options out there for Windows developers today, and we'll be touching on many of them today, focusing primarily on the options from Microsoft. I do a version of this talk that's a bit longer that goes into a few more options, some of the cross-platform things you can do. For this, we'll focus on the native Windows options, and if we have time at the end, maybe we'll touch on a few other things like Maui, Blazor Hybrid, and Uno platform, some of those. So a little bit about me. I was a software developer and architect for over 25 years, working primarily with Microsoft technologies, .NET, C#. I worked with WPF for many years. I've got a blog out there on alvinashcraft.com where I post links to interesting developer resources every day. I've written 3 books, 2 editions of a WinUI book and a parallel programming with .NET book. And I joined Microsoft a couple of years ago now. After writing the books, I decided that I wanted to change gears and move from developing full-time to writing content. So I write documentation, training modules, sample code for Microsoft on the Learn website. And I'm also a conference organizer. Been working on the Tech Bash Developer Conference since Tech Bash 2016, and our next event's coming up soon. Just a quick plug for that. Next month, if you're in the East Coast in the US, check it out, techbash.com. But today we'll be covering a few things here. We'll look at a brief history of Windows development, how it's evolved over the years. We'll look at the choices today, some pros and cons of each of them. We'll look at Windows Forms, WPF, WinUI 3, and the Windows App SDK. And if we have time, we'll get into some .NET Maui too. And we'll wrap up by looking at some guidelines you can use when choosing a framework. And then we'll have some links and a little bit of Q&A at the end, hopefully. So the history of .NET development. Back in 2002, when .NET first came out, we had Windows Forms, or WinForms as most people call it. That was the successor to the VB6 forms. And the designer for forms is nothing new with .NET. It was all the way back in Visual Basic 1991. There's a link here where Bill Gates demoed the Visual Basic forms designer. And then next up in 2006, the Windows Presentation Foundation, or WPF, was introduced around the same time as Windows Vista. And it was the first XAML-based UI framework from Microsoft. And it followed shortly by everybody's favorite web development framework, Silverlight, in 2007. WPF has become a big deal for enterprise developers. There's a lot of big apps out there written by companies on WPF. And between that and Windows Forms, they became the de facto choices for many years. So we'll skip over the Windows 8 XAML apps that came out in 2012 and talk about UWP. We won't dive into any examples today, but that came out in...
I'm sorry to interrupt, but it looks like your slides are not changing. You're still on the second slide.
Oh, strange. Should be, let me flip back. Do you see agenda?
No, you are on the second slide.
Let me go out of the presentation and...
Yeah, now I see it changing, yeah.
Okay.
Now it moved to agenda, yeah.
Okay, maybe I'll keep it out of presenter mode and just show it here in PowerPoint. All right. So yes, there was Tech Bash, the agenda, and here's the history slide that we're on. So we had WPF, and then UWP. We won't be looking at the examples today due to time, but that came out in 2015 with Windows 10. And then in 2021, there were a couple of things actually came out. In addition to WinUI 3 that you see on the slide there, that came out in the March timeframe. Later that year, there was Blazor and Blazor Hybrid controls came out. So you could embed Blazor apps inside of either a Maui app or WinForms or WPF forms. And I have an example of that in my code that folks can check out later, but we won't probably have time to look at that today. And then finally, .NET Maui. That's the successor of the Xamarin Forms that came out in 2022. And hopefully folks that were on Xamarin have migrated over to Maui, as Xamarin was deprecated this past spring. And this slide just shows some examples of the UI that you can make with each one. The first one in the upper left probably looks familiar to folks as Windows Forms UI. That's kind of the typical out-of-the-box, very Windows, I don't know, 95 looking UI. But on the bottom below that is also Windows Forms, and that shows what you can do with it. If you get some third-party controls, some theming that's offered by third parties, you can make things look pretty nice with WinForms. In the center, that's a Visual Studio. Most folks probably recognize that. And Visual Studio, most of it today is built with WPF. There are a few legacy dialogues still hanging around, but more and more they're converting those over to WPF. In the latest Visual Studio previews, even the options form is WPF. And below that, that's .NET MAUI. That's a weather sample app that the team created. If you search for .NET MAUI weather sample app, you can find the GitHub repo where that's hosted. So they use that to create phone and desktop versions of the same app using the same XAML. And on the right side is a couple of WinUI 3 examples. The one on the top is the Windows File Explorer and the current versions of Windows 11 that's been built with WinUI 3. And below that is the Apple Music app. Apple recently released 3 different apps using WinUI 3, Apple Music, the Apple TV, and Apple Devices app. Those are all made with WinUI 3 today. We'll start with the some advantages of Windows Forms. So WinForms, you get rapid UI development. It's got a designer that folks are familiar with. It's been using it for many years to quickly drag and drop and get up and running with an app very quickly. It's got nice support for data binding. You can set the properties to bind to a data source. Like I said earlier with the screenshots, there's extensive third-party control support for many years now. There are modern and legacy options. So you can still create today .NET Framework WinForms apps if you need to target some older operating systems that are no longer supported, but you've still got customers running on those. And then there's also the modern .NET WinForms. So on .NET 8 today, you can create a new WinForms app, and it's much faster than the old .NET Framework. It looks a little bit more modern. It's not quite the same as WPF or even WinUI today, but it looks a little bit better than the older WinForms. And you get, like I said, much better performance. And in .NET 9 with AOT or ahead of time compiling, things are going to get even faster load times, smaller memory footprint for all your apps. So make sure if you've got any legacy .NET Framework WinForms apps, you look at the .NET upgrade tool to see about migrating those and take advantage of some of the modern .NET features. It's still under active development today. There's dev teams working on new features. They're working on some accessibility, some more improvements for high DPI monitors, and actually the dark mode on there, I should take a question mark off of that. Last week when I was at VS Live, I saw a demo of the dark mode that they're working on for .NET 9, and it looks really great. And so the roadmap is out on GitHub. You can go to the WinForms repo under .NET and check out the roadmap of what's coming in the next release and some releases beyond that. And the best thing about Windows Forms is that every C# or VB developer is already a WinForms developer. You don't have to know a separate language for the UI. It's all in just C# or VB code. So a few drawbacks, and then we'll take a quick look at a demo of a WinForms project. So like we saw in the first screenshot, if you don't do any extra theming or third-party control integration, it does look a little bit dated. It looks like Windows Forms when you look at a form. You don't get the GPU acceleration like you get with the XAML-based languages. There's no C++ support. If you're a C++ dev, you need to look at WinUI to do something there. And there's no current support for Windows themes in dark mode, although that is coming probably very soon. It's looking like it'll make it in .NET 9. And it's also not great for touch and pen input. So if that's a big factor in your requirements, WinForms is probably not the best way to go. So let's switch over to Visual Studio. I've got a solution here with a bunch of different projects. I've got a shared project that's a .NET 8 library.
Alvin, I'm sorry to interrupt once again, but we only see your slides.
Okay, did I not?
Perhaps you'll have to click on share your entire screen and maybe not the window.
That's, entire screen. I said share screen and
Entire screen and then the screen.
Entire screen. Okay. Thank you. Perfect. Got it?
Yeah, we see your Visual Studio. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you for the tip. All right. So the shared project is a .NET 8 library, and that is shared by all the other projects in the solution except for the UWP, which we probably won't look at because UWP can't reference .NET 8, which is one of the major drawbacks that I talk about in the longer version of this. But in here, I've got just an item and a category for our shopping list app, and then the helpers just load some dummy data for each of the apps. Let's take a look at the WinForms app. That's the code behind, and let's look at the designer. All right, well, let's just run it quick to look at the design. So it's a simple form, and it looks like WinForms. We've just got a list of products here with category, name, a little checkbox to indicate if we've purchased it yet. And we can add new items by selecting a category and click the add button, and it adds it to the list. So we can mark other items as purchased, and we can delete items. So that's simple enough, and it's all done with data binding. So we've got some code in here that just loads up the categories, loads up the items, and sets the data source for the items and categories on the grid and the combo box. So it takes very little code to set all that up, and we're up and running. Let's talk about WPF next. So some advantages of WPF. So it uses XAML for the UI. It's an XML-based language. A lot of people have been using XAML and WPF for a number of years, but if you're not familiar with it, Visual Studio has a XAML designer where you can see what you're building either as you write the code in the XAML, or you can click and drag things in the designer itself to build your UI. It also has XAML hot reload for UI debugging, which lets you make small changes in your XAML code while the app is running, and it immediately reflects the changes in the UI. So kind of like when you're doing some web debugging, you can make changes and they automatically get reloaded if you're working in Angular and React. It's got a GPU accelerated UI, so it renders UI changes more quickly. It runs those on the GPU instead of the CPU, so you can offload some of your processing. It uses the DirectX pipeline. It's got rich data binding, and you can take advantage of the MVVM pattern for binding, create your view models, bind them to your view. We won't dive into the MVVM pattern here, but I give another talk on that dives real deep into that and uses the MVVM toolkit, which is part of the Microsoft Community Toolkit. It's got modern and legacy support like Windows Forms, so you can create .NET Framework WPF apps or the new modern .NET 8 WPF apps. And just like Windows Forms, you get better performance with the new .NET 8, and there's the .NET Upgrade Assistant to upgrade your framework projects. It's also got good third-party control and library support like Windows Forms. You can get some theming that way or some more rich controls. A lot of graphs and reports come through third-party controls. Yeah, it's under active development. Windows 11 theming support is actually coming in .NET 9, so you get your light and your dark theme, and all the controls look a little bit more modern, more like the WinUI controls do today. And I'll show a demo of that as well. I have a .NET 8 and a .NET 9 version of my WPF project. We can see the differences. And it's being positioned by Microsoft as one of the top choices to build native apps today. So if you're looking for native enterprise apps, it's really great with multi-window apps. If you have a big app with multiple windows, the window management in WPF is much better than in WinUI today. But some drawbacks. There's the XAML learning curve. If you're not familiar with XAML, it does take a little bit of getting used to compared to just building a WinForms app or maybe working in JavaScript. Just like WinForms, there's no C++ support. No dark mode switching yet, but that's coming very soon, definitely in .NET 9. No support for the Fluent design, which is kind of changing with .NET 9 as well. It's getting closer to what you get with WinUI and the Windows 11 look and feel. It's better than touch and pen input and WinForms, but it wasn't built with the touch and pen in mind like the UWP and WinUI apps are. And same with the UI performance. It's better than Windows Forms, but still not quite as good as WinUI today. Let's take a look at this project. So I've got WPF 8 and 9. Look at the 8 one first. So this looks a little bit more modern, still not quite as good as maybe some apps you've seen today from the Microsoft Store. But it's the same basic concept. We've got some controls for adding items at the top, and then we've got a grid to list them. Let's run this one quickly before we look at the other one. The same basic idea. I've got checkboxes, delete rows, and I can select some different options from there, and I can add items. So it's the same kind of logic as the WinForms app. I've got code behind that's just doing some basic data binding. So I'm loading by items and categories, and I'm just setting the data source on my view and my combo box. So the grid view, list view, and the combo box get set. And I've got logic for add and delete. There's no save implemented, and there's a clear that happens every time you add an item. It clears the boxes at the top. So the .NET 9 one is exactly the same, except currently in preview, you have to add some code to your app.xaml, which is shared logic throughout the app. And all this is doing in here is it's importing this fluent.xaml to be used as the style. So if we run this one for .NET 9, we'll see things look a little bit different. One thing you'll notice is it picked up my dark mode automatically. I have dark mode applied on my system, and it got that. And everything else looks a little bit more rounded. The controls are rounded like Windows. All the styles are getting picked up. And everything works exactly the same. The rest of the code is all the same except for importing that style. I can remove rows, check items. All right, let's hop back to the slides. And we'll talk about WinUI 3. Now, WinUI 3 is part of the Windows App SDK. And so the controls in there, they use the Windows 11 Fluent design today. The features and the controls are all the same as what you had in UWP, with a few exceptions of things that were still being ported over, but most of those have made their way into WinUI at this point. One of the advantages of WinUI over UWP is that there's more frequent updates. With UWP, it was tied to Windows versions in the Windows SDK, so you had to wait for a new version of Windows to ship before you could get updates to your app framework. with WinUI, it ships in a separate SDK, and they ship several releases a year for Windows App SDK. So some features of some recent releases, 1.2, 1.4, brought XAML islands. Those are C++ only right now. So that's sharing components between, say, WPF and WinUI. The theming, some theming enhancements came out in 1.2 and 1.4. Notifications, so some APIs to do Windows notifications came out. And an app window, which improved the windowing support that I mentioned with WPF. So you can do some multi-window things, but it's still not quite as powerful as what you can do with WPF and WinForms. And it added a media player. And then 1.5 brought a highly anticipated control to maps control, and also some layout improvements. And then 1.6 is coming out shortly. I think early September that should ship. The big feature coming there is native AOT, or ahead of time compiling, which will give you that faster startup time. A lot of apps are saying they're starting 50% faster, and a lot smaller assembly size. When you distribute your WinUI app, you can either include the entire framework with your app, or just distribute your app and rely on the pre-installed framework. When you just distribute your app, they're seeing packages that are 8 times smaller for deployment. So it's a big improvement with AOT. And they're also working on some improvements for title bar customization, some binding and IntelliSense changes. And they're doing some groundwork for some of the 1.7 controls that are on the way. And you can check out the entire roadmap on GitHub under the Windows App SDK repo. You also have rich data binding like you have with WPF using the MVVM pattern. It's great for touch and pen input. It's really built for that kind of input. You can do upgrades from UWP using the .NET Upgrade Assistant. It'll tell you what changes you need to make for an upgrade. And WinUI is really being positioned as the top choice for vendors to build native Windows apps today. And they're trying to prove that by building their own built-in apps like the File Explorer, and having partners like Apple and Adobe release WinUI apps as well. A few drawbacks quickly. There's no XAML UI designer. That's probably the biggest drawback. If you're not comfortable building UI with XAML, you have to code it all by hand, and there's no preview to see what you're building until you actually run the app. There's no F# or Visual Basic built in. There's C# and C++ only with WinUI. If you're coming from UWP, there's no Xbox or HoloLens support with WinUI, although HoloLens has been deprecated, and I haven't heard of too many people building Xbox apps anymore other than games. And there's no built-in data validation like you had with UWP, where it shows the little indicators if you didn't fill out the required field, or there's some custom formatting needed for your data entry. That's something that hopefully should be coming at some point. It's the top requested feature other than the UI designer. Let's see, we've got a few minutes left. Let's quickly take a look at the WinUI project. So this one, if I open it up, you'll see there's no preview, no designer. It's all just the XAML. So all this is built the same as WPF, the same layout. We've got a stack panel for the controls at the top, and the list for the list of items. And for this one, I use the MVVM pattern, and I have a view model with all my data. And this uses the MVVM toolkit from Microsoft. And if you get the code out of my GitHub under Alvin Ashcraft, I have a speaking repo. All the code's out there. You can grab it and play with it. But let's run this one. We have a couple minutes. And it looks kind of similar to the modern looking WPF. It also automatically picked up my dark theme. I can add some items. I can select and delete. And it works just the same. Now, while we have a couple minutes, I'm not going to have time to run through the Maui slides, but let me just run the Maui app. Actually, I didn't set my WinUI as the startup, so that was still the WPF. That's why it looked like that. We run that. So this is the WinUI app. There we go. That looks better. So we get more kind of animation with our drop downs. And when I add an item, it kind of fades into the grid. I don't know how well that comes over in the streaming, but instead of just popping up, you get a little bit of animation with things. And if I hit delete, things should slide up. Instead of just disappearing, you get a little animation. That's your WinUI. And I'm going to quickly switch to Maui to show you that. Maui, when it builds for Windows, creates a WinUI app. So this is going to look very similar to WinUI, except that Maui by default uses a lot of purple in their UI. So we'll have some purple buttons on this. I can delete, I get the same kind of animations because this is just a WinUI UI built with Maui. And the advantage with Maui is you can take the same XAML and you can deploy it to Windows, iOS, Android, and even watches with Samsung Tizen. All right, let's hop back to the slides, and we're going to have to quickly skip over Maui. Maui, like I said, is cross-platform. It's got the XAML experience. The drawbacks, whenever you're doing cross-platform, you're going to lose a little bit of performance. You always have to do some kind of workarounds when you're doing some platform-specific things that aren't supported on every platform. And then the other cross-platform options that we're not talking about today, Blazor Hybrid, you can embed in WPF WinForms or Maui. There's Uno Platform and Avalonia, which target everything that Maui does, plus you can get to Linux and to the web with WebAssembly. And the difference between these two, the main difference is Uno XAML is WinUI schema, and Avalonia is more like WPF. So it's just slightly different between those. So choosing a framework. So we talked about some of the differences. Programming language, if you're C++ or C# or VB, there's some different options based on that. Do you need the drag and drop designer? Do you like XAML? Do you not like XAML? What does your team feel comfortable with? What can they get to market with quickly? Do you need legacy Windows support? Do you need touch support? Do you need cross-platform? And long-term support, if you don't, obviously most people want to be supported for a long time, but if you don't and you really want to do UWP, it's still officially supported today, but it is just in maintenance mode. So you should go out, look at the public roadmap for each of the frameworks, decide if the features meet your needs. If WinUI features meet your needs, I think that's getting the most investment from the product teams right now. That's probably the way to go if they have what you're looking for. And then just to wrap up, some quick links. You can get these slides out on my repo as well. Alvin Ashcraft on GitHub under speaking. So I've got some pages on the Learn website you can look at. And I've got in my browser, if I switch to that quick, this session from Microsoft Build, Navigating WinUI App Development. This does some good deep dives into developing with WinUI and WPF and some of the choices you can make there.